Yeah. Let's move on to our main event for today then. Why Americans are obsessed with communism. Man, this one came in the Discord and I've been saving it for a while. I listened to part of it by myself and I was like, okay, this is one I got to break down with Carlos and or Noah. Otherwise I'm going to miss something cuz there's too much there. So, like I said, this lady is talking about why the US government is so obsessed with communism, which my dad has told me back in the day when the Cold War was going on, he always used to think in the back of his head, like, right, so we're fighting these wars to stop the spread of communism. Communism's a governmental system or a way of managing society. Why aren't these other countries allowed to go with their own way of managing society? Why aren't they allowed to have their own government? Why do we have to go to war with them to stop the spread of communism? So I think this is a question a lot of people have had in the back of their head. You know, people who, not Marxists, obviously, just regular people inundated with McCarthyism and imperialist propaganda probably thought to themselves at one point, wait, we're going to war with these countries to stop them from being communist? So that's kind of what the question this lady is going to try and answer. Why is the U.S. ruling class, why are the U.S. imperialists so obsessed with communism and stopping the spread of communism?
It's also important to call out the hypocrisy in the founding of um, the American project, because what's one of the central um, notions that's driving the Declaration of Independence is the right to revolution, and an understanding from a sociological standpoint that really people only do revolutions when the oppression has gotten to such a point where they realize that it's preferable to risk what's implied in a revolution than to continue on in the old way. Um, so, in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America, you have an understanding that, like, revolutions are not just like a thing you say, okay, let's do this on Tuesday. They're a product of a accumulated exploitation and oppression of the people that reaches a nodal point, a specific point where they then end up revolting in a revolutionary manner. And two, that revolutions are justified because they end up being the expression of a people that feel like their government doesn't represent them anymore, right? So if we're a country that was founded on the right to revolutionary, which at its time was a revolutionary way of founding a country, no other country was founded on that right. Why has it been that we have been the country that has played the leading role in stomping other countries that have had their own revolutions around the world, right? So calling out hypocrisy is always so important for this task that we were talking about earlier of, going from common sense to socialism, because the American people accept, in their majority, the Declaration of Independence and the values that are there. One of them is the right to revolution. And if you bring this to question, it forces them to think, yeah, it's true. If these countries decided, as the Declaration of Independence says, that people at some point end up doing to have a revolution, isn't it not only their right, but the Declaration of Independence says their duty to dispose of their government? And if it is, why are we intervening to prevent them from doing that? Isn't that against our own principles? Which means, isn't that making us into hypocrites, and putting us in contradiction with what we say are our principles and the principles we espoused in order to have the anti-colonial revolution against Britain? Um, it's a different approach to organizing and to tackling these questions than the ones that the modern left brings to the table, I think. Much more effective, in my view, or at least in my experience.
On April 30th, 1975, the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon fell to the Communist North Vietnamese army. After years of extremely deadly warfare that did nothing to turn the tides of communist takeover of the country, the South Vietnamese army could no longer continue the fight. The United States, after propping up the South Vietnamese and joining the fight against the Communist North, had pulled out 2 years prior, declaring the war.
They didn't join the fight, they started the fight. There would have been no South Vietnamese army, just like there would have been no South Korean army if it wasn't for the U.S. occupation, bombing campaign, and funneling of arms and weapons into their preferred groups. The South Vietnamese government, that was just a puppet government set up by the U.S., was being chased out of power as the U.S. was still leaving Vietnam. their helicopters were still flying over the jungle as the communists were chasing out the South Koreans. Nobody wanted to fight for this U.S. puppet dictatorship, which is why the U.S. military had to get so heavily involved. Same with Korea. They wanted to do it through proxy. They wanted to do it through just U.S.-backed soldiers on the ground. But there was nobody who would fight for the U.S., so we decimated both countries with bombs, Agent Orange, and napalm, and occupied the southern part of them.
A failure and withdrawing aid to the country that it had helped to destabilize. Now, a few thousand American army and diplomats remained in the country, and with the fall of Saigon, the remaining U.S. citizens, along with the Vietnamese citizens who aided them and their families, were in imminent danger. In the days leading up to the fall of Saigon, the North Vietnamese army was advancing rapidly, and it quickly became apparent that they would soon take the city. Vietnamese living in Saigon stood in lines outside the American embassy, attempting to get visas and flee the oncoming army, knowing that any connection to the U.S. would mean detention or death once the Northern Army took over. On April 29th, the North Vietnamese began shelling the U.S. airbase in Saigon, and the mass evacuation began. By this point, the North Vietnamese had blocked all waterways and airways to and from Vietnam. No planes could land and no ships could come to the rescue. The only way out was via helicopter evacuation to waiting U.S. Army ships out in open sea. The U.S. Embassy became the only way to escape Saigon. 10,000 Vietnamese pushed against U.S. Embassy gates, hoping to get a spot on the departing helicopters. Pilots flew for 19 hours straight. Helicopters landed in 10-minute intervals across the U.S. Embassy grounds, including on the embassy roof. In less than 24 hours, over 7,000 people were evacuated from Saigon via helicopter, including 5,500 Vietnamese citizens. On April 30th, what remained of the U.S.-backed South Vietnamese government resigned unconditionally, and North Vietnamese tanks drove through the streets of the now occupied South.
This is what happens when you try and set up a fucking government on top of another country's government. I can't stand how the fall of Saigon is always portrayed as this tragedy, where these the poor U.S. military base was shelled and they had to evacuate. We invaded their country, destroyed their land and people with Agent Orange and napalm for 20 years straight, and neighboring Laos and Cambodia. And then when they chased us out militarily, we acted like they were the aggressors, and they were the bad guys. When we tried to set up our own puppet government on top of their democratically elected government. And it was all to fight communism. That was literally how they justified it. We need to stop the spread of communism. As if people aren't allowed to choose their own system of governance.
I mean, what the fuck do these people think a revolution is? A picnic? Like, it always fractures society, and there's always going to be usually, if it's a socialist revolution, a small percentage of the population that is in favor of keeping the old way of things because they benefited from it, or because they were working on their false consciousness and thinking that they benefited from it when objectively they didn't. But I mean, you could do this for any revolution, right? You take the American bourgeois revolution, like, of course there were British people, going back to Britain, and that passage back wasn't all that friendly because they were loyalists and there had just been a revolutionary movement against the crown. You could take the example of France. You can take any bourgeois revolution because it's a general component of revolutions themselves. Revolutions are a form of civil war. A portion of the old people, the dominant classes, ends up aligning with the old order and not with the new one, and a large chunk of the people end up aligning and being the force behind the new revolutionary overthrow of the existing state of affairs. And it always fractures society, usually not equally, but like, compare the numbers that they're giving to like the rest of the Vietnamese population. But when they only focus in and narrow in on this small percentage of people, it's the same thing they do with Cuba. And the Cuban bourgeoisie that fled after the revolution, and the petty bourgeoisie and the intelligentsia that fled. It's like, yeah, if that's your narrative and you're basing it on 1% or 3% of Cubans, I mean, what can I tell you? It's just not true. It's not the reality that the vast majority of Cubans experienced during and after the revolution. And the same thing here with the Vietnamese.
I mean, all you ever have to do with these imperialist interventions is put the shoe on the other foot. Imagine Russia invades the U.S. and sets up their own government in Florida. And they're like, this is the government of the U.S. now. And then a bunch of American citizens side with Russia and start fighting the government. Like, yeah, those people would be detained. Those people would face prison time or whatever. Those people wouldn't be allowed to just walk free after siding with a colonial imperialist government trying to take over your country. But yeah, it just hyper focuses on those people and says, "Oh, look at these brave refugees fleeing the crazy Vietnamese communists who are defending their own country and trying to have democracy like crazy people."
Saigon. A military government was instituted, and on July 2nd, 1976, the country was officially united as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. What started as U.S. intervention to keep communism from spreading further into Asia ended in a bloody, failed, years-long war that resulted in over 58,000 U.S. military deaths and over 3 million Vietnamese people killed. And for what? Well, to fight the commies, of course. The United States defeat of Vietnam betrayed an uncomfortable truth that many Americans don't want to admit to this day. Maybe a war against communism can't be won. Maybe the lines between us and them, between the good guy and the bad guy, once so seemingly clear and incredibly black and white, are much more blurry than our collective imagining of the American consciousness can account for. But how did we get here? Why did the United States take on the fight to root out communism at all costs in the first place? And what does it accomplish? I set out to figure out the answer to this question, and what I found, frankly, can't be thoroughly summed up in a tidy YouTube video. But I'll do my best to explain why the United States is so obsessed with communism. Roll the intro.
That was pretty interesting there. And this is where I stopped watching the video and said, I'm just going to watch this with Carlos. So I haven't seen it after this point. But yeah, of course, we know why the U.S. is so obsessed with communism. It's because of capitalist imperialism, because they recognize communism and Marxism as the greatest ideological threat to the ruling class, to the capitalist class. So they want to shut that down wherever it goes. They want to stop communists from gaining power. Once capitalism becomes a global system, class struggle becomes global. These contradictions become global. So it's not just the ruling capitalist class trying to stop class struggle in their own country, but they try and prevent class struggle abroad in other countries. And if it looks like a working class is going to seize power and create their own government, like what's happened in Cuba or Laos or Vietnam, they're going to try and stop that. Because as we're seeing now with the rise of this multipolar world, if there are more socialist countries trading with each other and helping each other develop and showing solidarity with one another, it hurts the U.S.'s economic interests. It prevents the U.S. from exploiting those countries and holding them in a state of arrested development, preventing the advancement of their productive forces. And it allows the U.S. to super exploit them. So, these countries moving towards communism hurts the U.S.'s economic interests. And that's what it's all about.
Growing up in the United States as a teen in the early 2000s, I remember being taught a pretty whitewashed and sterile version of U.S. history, especially our history and conflicts related to communism. The conflicts we were involved with as a nation were written as almost preordained. This happened because it had to happen, as though history is a series of logical steps, as opposed to a messy smattering of events that we have to organize in hindsight. And the United States history with communism is certainly messy. But before we get into why the heck we're so obsessed with it, let's get some definitions out of the way. What the heck even is communism? Well, to answer that question, we also have to answer the question, what is socialism? Because communism is a type of socialism, or an outgrowth of socialism. In the most basic sense, socialism is a social and economic system that involves public, as opposed to private, ownership and control of property and natural resources. Under the socialist view, individuals live in cooperation with one another, and everything people produce is in some sense a social product. So everyone who contributes is also entitled to a share in the production of society. Therefore, the society as a whole should own or control property for the benefit of all its members. This is, of course, an extremely simplified view of socialism, and two key divisions have occurred to complicate this doctrine. First, socialists disagree on...
I was going to say, under capitalism, everything that's produced is a social product still. It's just the way that production is managed and the way that it's appropriated. The surplus of that product is appropriated privately by capitalists. The people who own the productive forces, but who aren't involved in the collective production process. So production is carried out collectively, in factories, on assembly lines, whatever, humans meeting collectively to produce. But the surplus of what's produced is appropriated privately, appropriated by the capitalist who isn't even taking part in that collective act of production. So it's socialized production for individual appropriation. That's what capitalism is. Socialism is socialized production for the social good. Her explanation wasn't horrible, but...
And at least she's honest. She says at the end it's a simplified thing. And I don't know how necessary it was for her getting to her next point. And nonetheless, I always quiver when I hear, we got to get to the definition of socialism or the definition of communism, because it's like, well, from the Marxist standpoint, at least, these things define themselves as they develop materially. If we're working with this sort of doctrinaire, idealist definition of what it is, we end up like the Western Marxists, which is rejecting actually existing socialism for this pure ideal in our head, this pure definition of socialism in our head. And that's not at all what the Marxists want. And I think the very basic level should be that socialism includes, at the most fundamental level, and you can then add determinations from there on, the working class's conquest of political power, or the producers' conquest of political power. That way, we can include the peasantry, and that's it. And sometimes the capital is expropriated slower than in other times. Sometimes it's fully nationalized, as it was necessary in Cuba. Sometimes it's not the case, and you have a mixed mode of production, as you had in China. But those are questions that solve themselves only after the working class grabs power. So it's a working class government that begins to shift the state and the forces of production towards working for working people and being controlled by working people.
Right. I think it's notoriously hard to define socialism and communism. That's because, as Engels says, definitions can be useful, but they're also flawed because things are always developing, things are always changing. A definition of a thing is going to need to adapt or change and develop, which is why it makes no sense for these people who say, China isn't real socialism, based on the definition of socialism taken from a book 200 years ago or whatever. Like, well, they had a working class revolution and they're working to build a society and build a state free of exploitation. What do you call that other than socialism? The exact definition of what socialism looks like is always going to be in flux. So that, and you still have principles, you still have the word socialism still means something, but definitions aren't hard and fast.
The extent and kind of property that society should own and control. Should society own everything, including the shirt off your back? Or is there flexibility for some private ownership? What about small businesses like farms and shops? And second, there's disagreement about the way in which society is to exercise its control over property and resources. Via a centralized government, via a decentralized cooperation of multiple local governments, or something else. These ideas have been around for centuries, but socialism got its formal name around the 1830s.
I do want to say, too, because I feel that it's important, the debate about centralization versus decentralization is so silly. You need both. You need decentralization for centralization to work and vice versa. Perfect example, the party cadres and the poverty alleviation programs in China. You have party cadres who are in charge of every geographic area, right? That is decentralized. The people report to the cadres, tell them what they need, but then the cadres report back to the party so that decisions and economic plans can be made centrally, right? And so that central body of power, the state, can make sure that the entire economy is being carried out according to this central plan, according to what's best for society. And they're learning what's best from society from the party cadres, which again is a decentralized form of power. So these centralized forms of power, like the state and the Communist Party of China, work together with the decentralized forms of power or forms of the state or the party. So this debate between centralization and decentralization is kind of silly. And I think it just stems from anarchists saying all the time, I want a decentralized form of power. I want the workers to meet in councils and decide everything. Like, do you guys know what the Soviets were? Like, no offense, but that's literally what the Soviets were in the Soviet Union. They were workers' councils where the workers could meet and decide things. So yeah, there's an obsession with decentralization and anarchism that I think is pretty useless.
And it's grounded again on a bourgeois either or. You either have centralization or decentralization, and you fail to realize in doing so that the positive character of centralization comes out through decentralization, and the positive character of decentralization comes out through centralization. It's the same thing as like how a party should function. Democratic centralism. If you don't have one, not only do you not have that one which you don't have, but you also lack the best parts of the other, right? they're interdependent in the sense that in order to fully have one, you need to have it with the other.
Dialectics.
And the idea of socialism as we know it today got its rise during the Industrial Revolution, which makes sense. You had a shift from agrarian society to free market capitalism and a conglomeration of power in the hands of large businesses that were then concentrating the wealth in the hands of the few, while workers lived in poverty and worked under increasingly dangerous conditions. The Communist Manifesto was published in 1848 by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They criticized early ideals of...
I wish people would talk about the bourgeois revolutions that happened more. You know, the bourgeoisie seizing power from the previous owners of society. And I even wish more Marxists understood that. You know, I saw again recently a Marxist criticizing the American Revolution because it was bourgeois and trying to say it wasn't progressive because it was bourgeois. Oh, that, you know, an anti-colonial revolution by the bourgeoisie is progressive, right? Or you know, you could say the Civil War was the bourgeois economy, the capitalist economy, fully kicking out the slave-based economy. That is a progressive step. Sorry, little side rant there. I won't go on another tangent.
Socialism as being unrealistic utopian dreams. Instead, they advocated for a strong central government to control all aspects of economic production and provide its citizens with their basic needs like food, shelter, medical care, and education. Communism was also...
The centralized government doesn't control all aspects of economic production. Like I just said, you have workers' councils and decentralized forms of power that report to the central government.
Sometimes referred to as revolutionary socialism, because Marx and other communist thinkers argued that all of history was, in the end, a history of class struggles. He believed that the working class or proletariat would inevitably triumph through revolutionary struggles over...
And this is where it would be helpful to talk about the bourgeois revolutions that preceded this. So it's not just, you know, socialist revolutions that Marx predicted would come out of nowhere. He's looking at previously existing societies and how they changed with class struggles and with revolutionary struggles.
For the wealthy class or bourgeoisie, gaining control over the means of production and ultimately erasing class distinctions. And this theory was put to the test in Russia during the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the installation of the world's first communist government in the Soviet Union. In the United States, around this time, the Socialist Party was seeing its heyday. In the years before World War I, the Socialist Party in the United States claimed 113,000 members, making it one of the largest socialist movements in the world. In the 1912 and 1920 elections, the Socialist Party gained 900,000 votes, most notably for Eugene V. Debs, who was running for president at one point, running from prison. I made a whole separate video about that. In 1919, the party splintered when the communist members split and eventually formed the Communist Party USA. Though their official numbers were smaller, topping out at 66,000 members in 1939, the Communist Party was able to amass 115,000 votes for Senate races in 1940. That all fell apart after World War II. Despite the fact that the United States was briefly allied with Russia to defeat Germany during World War II, immediately after the war, Russia claimed control over much of Eastern Europe instead of reinstating independence to the countries it helped liberate from the Germans, thus forming...
No! It is still established socialist control after liberating them from the Germans. Or they kicked the Nazis out and then let these people build their own governments, or, you know, encouraged socialist or revolutionary governments to take control rather than the fascistic governments. And that's what, like, the Soviet invasion of Hungary was, which is originally was how people started getting called tankies, because the Soviet Union went into these a few places to kick out fascist governments that had literally taken power of the government. And the U.S. media kept showing images in the news of the tanks rolling in, the Soviet tanks. And then anybody who supported that was labeled as a tanky. But yeah, I mean, just study the governmental system, study the system of democracy that were set up in any of the so-called Soviet satellite states. They had far more democracy than, you know, any Western capitalist country, any country in West Europe, you know, that they could be compared to. And of course, they weren't perfect. You know, none of these countries were, but they had far more democracy than any of the capitalist countries, and they were not Soviet colonies. And in fact, there's a leaked CIA document or CIA report where they said this was a propaganda tactic that they were going to try and use, was accusing the Soviet Union of imperialism to try and conflate what they were doing with what the U.S. was doing, when in fact, of course, the Soviet Union, based on the right to self-determination, the principle of self-determination, was supporting anti-colonial struggles, whether socialist or not, all across the global South. Anti-colonial struggles and independent struggles in Africa and countries like that. So To act like they were the same colonial imperialist superpower that the U.S. was is just CIA version of history.
Right, and it leaves out the fact that what the West was doing after the Second World War was propping up bourgeois governments on the rubble of,
And
many
fascist
countries.
governments. Sorry.
Right, bourgeois and fascist governments on the rubble of what was left after the Second World War, and it was only as a reaction to that that the Soviet Union started getting the countries that were on the east and having the establishment of socialist republics there, where, of course, as you mentioned, people lived and had securities that were much more profound than anywhere else in the West. But it's also important to note that stuff like the Comintern was dissolved in order to prevent like the communist threat in various of those Western European countries, and countries like Greece and like Italy that had genuine potentials for communist revolution to succeed. They were pushed back against by the Soviet Union as a sort of I'm losing the word here, but as a compromise to the West, right? Um, so it misses so much of the history. Where if anything, if you're going to critique the socialists and the communist camp for anything, it would be on for being too soft on the imperialists and for giving them and their promises too much weight.
For sure.
But
And
what else could they do right after the results of the Second World War on the Soviet economy, on Soviet lives and their population? Like, what the fuck else could they do? They couldn't directly wage a fight against Western imperialism right after, especially after the U.S. came out basically unscathed from the Second World War because of how late it went into the game and how little of the fighting it ended up doing. And now you have people in the U.S. wearing fucking shirts that say "back-to-back World War champs." I mean, come on, but.
that's a facepalm moment. Like, come on, Americans. Yeah, and we compared the Soviet countries to the West European countries. The prototypical example is Germany, because you had East and West Germany. Obviously, the country was split. And as we said, East Germany and the Soviet states weren't perfect. But if you want a comparison that shows how much better the East German economy was, and the East German efforts at democracy were, read Victor Grossman, who lived in East Germany at the time. He's heavily critical of the government and of the Stasi, and of things that went on at the time, or the Berlin Wall, things that the socialists were forced to do in order to survive. But he's very clear that the situation in East Germany was better than West Germany in many ways when it came to democracy and economic stability. And that economic stability and democracy just collapsed, with the fall of the Soviet Union, and the country was neoliberalized, and living standards got much, much worse, and political repression got much, much worse for East Germany under capitalism, which is what happened in every single one of these Soviet states, including the ones that, some of the least successful states under socialism still got much, 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 much worse under capitalism.
The USSR. It was in this fallout from World War II that the US obsession with communism took full force. Prior to the Second World War, communists and socialists existed in the United States with some skepticism, especially given the human rights abuses committed by the newly formed Soviet Union. But after the Second World War, the zeitgeist against communism began in full force. This was aided by the founding of the House Un-American Activities Committee. Founded in 1938 to root out Nazi sympathizers in the government, the committee became a central force for rooting out communism in all arms of society, including holding highly publicized hearings targeting Hollywood, leading to the creation of a blacklist and ruining the careers and lives of many budding artists in Hollywood for the next decade. In 1947, President Truman put forth what would become known as the Truman Doctrine, pledging that the United States would help any nation resist communism in order to prevent its spread. This policy was also known as the containment policy. Like, all right, maybe we can't defeat the Russians, but it has to stop with them. We must.
That's such an insane anti-democratic policy, a policy that goes against everything that the U.S. claims to be about in our Constitution. It's an anti-constitutional policy. Just like my, dad was saying when he's getting more political, but when he was apolitical, he's like, wait, we can go into these countries and drop bombs on them because they want to be socialist? I thought we supported democracy, like the illogic of it. It's amazing that so many people were brainwashed into this.
Contain communism at all costs. That same year, Truman signed Executive Order 9835, which provided the FBI with broad powers to investigate federal employees for potential security risks, aka communist sympathizers and spies sending information to the Soviets. And also in 1947, Truman created the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, and quickly began using the new agency's covert activities to promote his containment theory. Then in 1949, the Soviet Union exploded its first atomic bomb, and the United States was like, oh no, we're supposed to be the only ones capable of ending life on Earth with the push of a button, boo. And then a few months later, the Chinese Communist Party officially declared victory in the Chinese Civil War that had been raging since 1927. So much for containment. This led to increased fear that secret communists...
Shout out to the Rosenbergs, who were the ones that filtered the information on how to make the nukes to the Soviets. They're celebrated as heroes in Cuba. My parents used to go to the rallies with everyone else celebrating the Rosenbergs, and one of the moments that has brought the most that I've been the most proud of, and that my parents have been the most proud of, was when one of my articles that was published in Monthly Review, the son of the Rosenbergs ended up emailing my department, my philosophy department in school, and looking for a way to get in contact with me to congratulate me on my article. And I established contact with them, and were able to publish some of their stuff on Midwestern Marx. But I remember telling my dad, my parents, and they're like, holy shit, like we used to go out from the time we were little kids to celebrate the Rosenbergs, because they literally saved the world. They balanced the global forces and allowed the socialist camp to have, the necessary means to prevent the full-on attack of the empire, which unfortunately, but realistically, means that if you have nukes, you're not going to get fucked with in the same way that if you don't have nukes. So
absolutely. And denuclearization is pushed pretty hard in liberal societies, but what the US means by that is all of our enemies has to denuclearize. We can keep them though. And our buddy James Ray, who used to not be a fan of Midwestern Marx and used to have some liberal tendencies, but, like a year or two ago, had a real shift towards being a staunch Marxist-Leninist. And he made a TikTok arguing in favor of nuclear weapons for countries like the DPRK. And he got a lot of shit from that, even from people who liked him. So solidarity with James. And, he made a great TikTok video about why communists shouldn't support denuclearization. Makes the point that, look at what happened to Libya. Libya gave up their nuclear program. NATO invaded. The DPRK has nukes. NATO hasn't been able to invade.
Within the United States government had been spying for the Soviets, sending them bomb-making secrets and thwarting communications that could have enabled the U.S. to ward off the communist victory in China. And it was in this national atmosphere, just ripe with fear, that Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy burst onto the scene in February of 1950. At what was supposed to be a...
Boo! Making Wisconsin look bad. Hold on.
You suck! You suck!
Low-profile speech in the small town of Wheeling, West Virginia, McCarthy waved a sheet of paper in the air, proclaiming to the audience, I have here in my hand a list of 205 names that were made known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party, and who, nevertheless, are still working and shaping U.S. policy. It was later revealed that he didn't actually have a list, and when pressed for names, he waffled, saying he actually had 57 names, and then saying he had 81 names, and then finally promising that he definitely had at least one name for one communist in the government. But even though his evidence was shaky at best, that didn't matter. He had lit the flame, fanned by fear and paranoia of what would become known as the Red Scare. Throughout the early 1950s, American leaders regularly told the public to be fearful of the subversive influence of communism in their lives. Communists could be lurking anywhere, on college campuses, in labor unions, among artists and journalists, in your children's school. Boo! Senator McCarthy capitalized on this paranoia, launching a series of highly publicized probes into alleged communist penetration into all arms of the government, the State Department, the White House, the Treasury, the Army. At the University of California, 31 professors were dismissed in 1950 for refusing to sign a loyalty oath. The Senate Internal Security Act mandated that all communist organizations had to register with the government, giving the Senate greater power to investigate potential communists for sedition and revoking or barring citizenship to suspected communists. This anti-communist fervor played out in courtrooms as well. In 1950, a couple named Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were indicted on charges of giving nuclear secrets to the Russians. Julius had worked briefly at the U.S. Army Signal Corps Laboratory in New Jersey, where he had access to classified information. He and his wife Ethel had also...
I just want to say the fact that some of the stuff passed through our legal system and that this was just openly the policy of the U.S. government at the time that you're not allowed to be communist and we'll go to war with any country who becomes communist, it shows how liberalism always fails to live up to its own ideals. Right? When you critique liberalism, liberals go, well, how could you argue against freedom of speech and freedom of political expression? Like, well, because liberal societies never, ever, 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 ever live up to those ideals. Right? A Marxist analysis of these societies tells us much more about how they work. Right? When you have a superstructure, a legal and political system that is conditioned by and create the economics of society. So you have the ruling capitalist class, the legal system, and the political system, and the military comes to be controlled by them and fight for their interests. So you have a legal system that makes being communist essentially illegal, and a political system that says we'll invade any communist country. No, it's not in line with any of the ideals of liberalism, but it's completely in line with the interests of the capitalist ruling class. So the Marxist analysis of legal systems and political systems tells us much more about liberalism than what the ideals of liberalism tell us about itself.
Also been members of the American Communist Party in the 1930s. Based on evidence that was shaky at best, Ethel and Julius were found guilty in 1951 of espionage under Section 2 of the Espionage Act of 1917, which stated that anyone found guilty of transmitting information related to national defense to a foreign country could be imprisoned for life or put to death. In June 1953, both Ethel and Julius were executed via the electric chair. Several decades later, evidence came out that definitively showed Julius, but not Ethel, had given information to the Soviet Union. If the Espionage Act of 1917 sounds familiar, that's because it's the same law that Chelsea Manning, Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, and more recently, the former president of the United States, Donald J. Trump, have all been accused or charged with violating. The Rosenbergs remain the only people put to death for espionage during peacetime in the United States. The FBI continued to fan the flames of the Red Scare by assisting in the production of blatant anti-communist propaganda films and television shows, including The Red Menace in 1949, My Son John in 1951, and I Led 3 Lives that ran from them.
And honestly, like, this girl is probably not. I mean, probably not. She's not a communist. She's probably against communist countries. But when it comes to like the position she's taking as an American, they're objectively on our side. If she's against like U.S. Meddling in the affairs of of countries that have decided to take the communist and socialist route, she's on our side. A hell of a lot more than the so-called democratic socialists who vote in favor of sending billions of dollars to Nazis and who agree with all of the sanctions regimes that we're putting on socialist countries, or who at least are indifferent to it. At least she's making a very well-edited video about how it is that the U.S. has fucked with countries that have decided through their own right to self-determination to go down the socialist route, and in a way kind of implying the hypocrisy that's present in our actions when we do that.
It reminds me of RFK. And like we said, liberalism never lives up to its own ideals, but there are still sort of classical liberals, like maybe this lady or RFK, who want liberalism to live up to its ideals, who are honest about our current system and realize it's a inept, corrupt, militaristic dictatorship that really is controlled by the military industrial complex and a handful of large corporations and finance capitalists. So they're critical of the American security state and the wars and the pharmaceutical industry. And, you know, it's important to find alliances in these places and, you know, also recognize the kind of support that a message like that can galvanize. I mean, like what RFK is doing right now. We just got to re-articulate people's consciousnesses towards socialism, towards Marxism.
1953 to 1956. In these films, as well as in other government propaganda and fear-mongering, anti-communism was aligned with U.S. pride over patriotism, religious conviction, and an unflinching faith in the promise of capitalism and the American dream. These were embedded in the U.S. consciousness, along with anti-communism, as undeniably American values. And anything that didn't align with these values was viewed with suspicion. The paranoia led to a rigid enforcement of conformity, and any behavior considered deviant was seen as dangerous. Women who had taken an important place in the workforce during World War II were told to leave their jobs and go back to the home where they belong. Black people were told to conform to the American social order after fighting and dying for their country. Being gay, which was already stigmatized, became dangerous, as any personal secrets could potentially expose you to blackmail. Many anti-communists, including...
We wrote an article about that, or our friend Jimmy did, in the Journal of American Socialist Studies 1, about the persecution of gay communists who were targeted because they were gay, or I mean, because they were communists and because they were gay, but the fact that they were gay was utilized by the ruling class to smear them and attack them and out them to their families and communities at a time when it wasn't widely accepted. So a hint of lavender by our buddy Jimmy, who I don't know if he's in the stream today. He's a pretty consistent viewer and writer for Midwestern Marx. That's a great article. I just wanted to shout out.
Senator McCarthy believed that gay men were morally weak and were therefore particularly predisposed to betraying their country, and that lesbians and gay men could be easily blackmailed by Soviet agents because of their deviant sexual behavior. Not only that, but religion, and most importantly Christianity, became a central bulwark for warding off impending communist doom. McCarthy described the anti-communist movement as an all-out battle between communistic atheism and Christianity. Religious conservatives pushed for the traditional nuclear God-fearing family to protect against the spread of atheistic communism, which was often conflated with totalitarian.
I mean, I know she's a liberal, but, you know, to use the words of the youth, I mean, it's based what she's saying. You know, it's she's debunking these artificial and fake sort of bifurcations that are created by the State Department and McCarthyism. It's literally you know, even part of how we phrase things. Like McCarthyism makes people try to believe that you have America on this side and quote unquote American values on this side, and then there's an unbridgeable gulf between that and communism on the other side. And communism is anti-Americanism. And we've developed this critique into how certain parts of the communist left end up accepting that and participating in a form of left-wing McCarthyism. But, you know, I know she's a liberal, not a communist, but effectively through what she's saying, like, it's true, and a lot of it is true, and it helps us overcome a lot of these wrongful assumptions. And how many views does this video have, by the way? We usually react to stuff with a few hundreds of thousands of views.
234,000.
Oh, that's not bad.
Not as many as some of the videos we react to, but yeah, it's too based. The YouTube algorithm probably sensed that it was too commie and suppressed it. Someone sent this in Discord.
After the war. Public displays of religiosity became a prime way in which Americans sought to differentiate themselves from what they considered to be atheist communism. The Pledge of Allegiance was altered to include the words "One Nation Under God" in 1954. "In God We Trust" was adopted as the official national motto.
It was written by a socialist Christian from Florida, by the way. The Pledge of Allegiance. So that's a fun fact.
In 1956, and one of the most popular films of the decade was The Ten Commandments, which retold the story of Exodus as a Cold War parable. Through this paranoia and propaganda, communism became
written by Biggie Smalls, by the way. It's a wonderful movie.
linked with amorality, and the idea of fighting communism was permanently implanted in the American psyche as inherently moral, Christian, patriotic, and the ultimate show of being a true American. And the internal fight to root out communism from all facets of American life mirrored and was often overshadowed by external conflicts to further the initial doctrine of containment that President Truman declared at the end of World War II. I can't give you an exhaustive retelling of the many strings.
Super patriotism, exactly. And they called the communists, you know, American-hating people who want to destroy your way of life and take away your toothbrush and blah, blah, blah. And, you know, it's almost like a lot of leftists today have internalized McCarthyism. You know, they're like, yeah, I literally hate America and everybody living in it. You know, it's not that I want to sublate the country and turn it into something new and better and put it on a path of construction. I just want to destroy it. I just want the country to crumble and everyone in it to suffer. Which is anti-Marxist. I don't even know what you would call that. Just defeatist doomerism, Marxist or Maoism, third worldism, I guess, is the closest ideology you could lump it in with. But yeah, there's a reason that Joseph McCarthy and the ruling class spent so much time, money, and energy pushing that kind of idea that you know, to be patriotic is to support U.S. imperialism and capitalism. And the communists are anti-patriotic and want to destroy everything that you hold dear. So it's important to reject that narrative and say, no, as communists, we want to give you a better life. We want to improve your standard of living. We want to make the government one that serves you the working class Americans rather than corporate America, which every American in the country knows the government serves corporate America at this point.
That the U.S. pulled internationally in its fight against communism, because we ain't got the time, but also because I can guarantee you that there's a lot we simply don't know. But let me give you a smattering of examples so you can get a feel for it, because if anti-communism inside America seemed messy, boy howdy was it a catastrophe abroad. In June 1950, the North Korean army invaded South Korea, bringing to fruition the United States' biggest fears and the reason for the containment doctrine. The United Nations and the United States quickly sent troops over to try to push the North Koreans back and keep South Korea from falling to communist rule. Over the course of 3 bloody years, the border between North and South Korea moved dramatically. When the war ended in a truce in 1953, 36,000 American servicemen were dead, and the border between North and South Korea remained largely unchanged from before the war. In 1950, the same year as the start of the Korean War, Jacobo Arbenz was democratically elected to the presidency of Guatemala. He wasn't a communist, but he was backed by all the leftist parties in the country. Arbenz was committed to what he termed modernization in Guatemala. The main initiative he launched during his presidency was a major agrarian reform bill. As part of that bill, any mass ownership of land where most of the land was not being cultivated would be bought back from the landowners using government bonds and then given to the local peasants to cultivate. Arbenz proposed this bill, and the democratically elected parliament passed it. But here's the pesky thing about land reform. The people with a lot of land really don't like it. And they often have a lot of money to fight it. Ever heard of United Fruit Company? By 1950, the United Fruit Company was the largest landowner and employer in.
I'm wondering how this fits in, because Arbenz wasn't communist or even socialist, and all he wanted to do was take the land that United Fruit Company wasn't using productively and give it to the peasants or the people so that they could use it productively. So just because he wanted to take the unused land and redistribute it, the Dulles brothers, one of whom was actually a shareholder or a member of United Fruit, and the other was the head of the CIA at the time, really pushed for this coup against Arbenz. And this is where the U.S. started claiming that anybody who accused the CIA of being involved in this was a conspiracy theorist. This is the first time they pulled out that little tactic that they're still using today of calling everyone a conspiracy theorist that criticizes U.S. imperialism.
And that was overseen by Edward Bernays, who oversaw the propaganda in order to ensure that consent was given for our operations in Latin America, specifically in Guatemala.
Guatemala. They also made an annual profit of $65 million, which was twice the revenue of the government of Guatemala. And higher ups in the United Fruit Company, they knew that the Americans hated the communists, so they started doing a little lobbying. The company spent $500,000 on convincing United States lawmakers and civilians that Arbenz needed to be overthrown. But it wasn't just powerful lobbying, no. While the United States was freaked out about communists infiltrating the government, they were perfectly fine with private interests infiltrating every aspect of government operations. Attorney John Foster Dulles had represented the United Fruit Company as their attorney. In 1950, he was the U.S. Secretary of State. His brother, Alan Dulles, was the director of the CIA. Alan also sat on the board of directors of the United
Holy cow. I called it.
Fruit Company. In 1953, Eisenhower authorized the CIA operation to overthrow the government of Jacobo Arbenz. News of this operation was leaked to the Arbenz government, who accused the United States of preparing to overthrow a democratically elected president. The U.S. flatly denied the allegations and accused Arbenz of falling victim to communist propaganda, which the media and American people ate right up. By 1954, Arbenz was badly in need of weapons because the United States had started blocking arms sales to Guatemala in 1951. So he secretly bought weapons from Czechoslovakia, which of course was then immediately portrayed by the U.S. government as Soviet interference and the establishment of a new communist stronghold right in our own backyard. And that was all the CIA needed to officially launch its coup. By June of
And what this shows too is that it's not necessarily the ideology of communism that drives imperialism. It's the economics of it. It's production, right? Arbenz wasn't a communist or a socialist. He just wanted to redistribute land, but they smeared him as a communist and a socialist to justify regime change. Right. And the reason they don't like the ideology of communism is because they know that leads to land redistribution, that leads to a change in production where the working class can take control, and therefore the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, loses control. So it's production that drives these things, not necessarily the ideology of communism.
1954. Realizing he had lost the support of his army and his people, Arbenz formally resigned the presidency. In the power vacuum left by the coup, a military junta took control of the country, eventually installing Carlos Castillo Armas, a member of the right-wing National Liberation Movement, who created an authoritarian government that was closely allied with the United States. He was also the first of numerous authoritarian rulers.
Fun fact, Che Guevara was in Guatemala when this went down. He was hiding in one of the embassies, taking shelter. And the U.S. knew that the communists would have been scattered and, fleeing once the Castillo Armas coup was in action because they didn't want to die. And they told Castillo Armas to massacre everybody who was hiding in the embassies. They just wanted him to kill everyone, Pinochet style, just round up all the communists and execute them. But Castillo Armas wouldn't because he was afraid that it would cause an insurrection against him. Che Guevara lived, went on to lead a revolution in Cuba, and the U.S. would go on to be much more murderous in their regime change efforts and commit many, many massacres, probably trying to not make the same mistake again of letting a revolutionary escape from under their nose.
In Guatemala, whose reversal of Arbenz reforms led to the Guatemalan Civil War, which lasted from 1960 to 1996. In 1960, the Republic of Congo declared its independence from Belgian rule and held its first.
So now she's just going to go through a bunch of the coups that the U.S. did and justified by saying it was to contain communism. But
in each case,
pretty good video.
In each case, it's important to note, and she doesn't fully do that. Of course, she's being very brief, but it's important to note the immense amount of people that die, not just communists and activists and organizers against the existing fascistic U.S. propped up regimes, but also just regular indigenous people. I read this book in undergrad, Leeja, which is the sort of tales of an indigenous woman whose father ended up becoming a communist in the struggles against the coup government that was propped up by the U.S. after the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz, and just the life that indigenous people had to endure. It was like living under a terroristic form of it. It was just horrific, just completely horrific. Any semblance of like democratic rights were stripped, and just you listen to the accounts of like their lives, and all that you can connect it to is like the life of people in concentration camps in Nazi Germany. It was just completely horrific, and that's the reality that the U.S. would impose in a lot of Latin America in order to prevent what they called the communism, which was usually just like, let's like not have American multinational corporations exploit the shit out of our people and extract all of our resources so they can get rich and we stay poor. Which I guess that's aligned with the communists, but a lot of the time it wasn't like communist parties coming to power.